Well, thank you so much, Derrick, for joining me today. This has been a long time coming and a true honor to really discuss your journey, Tentree's journey, and we'll get into veritree a little bit as well. Before we started recording, you mentioned you're about to cross the 100 million tree threshold for Tentree. So obviously, huge congratulations to that. And that's kind of where I want to start is really just Tentree. And it's kind of grown to this, really one of the, I would say one of the most, the biggest, one of the biggest impacts brands sort of in our industry as you look at e-commerce and, sustainable fashion and sort of this model of, purchasing apparel for it to sort of impact the world in a lot of different ways downstream after the purchase. Talk about the origins of Tentree and just the ideation of it. And we'll start there, man, and get into a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, you bet. And thanks for having me, Grant. Long time coming. Yeah, I guess the origin of Tentree, it kind of goes back to when I was in high school. My brother and I, we had a tree planting company. It was sort of our first real job. And the idea behind this tree planting company we had was, let's plant trees and let's sell carbon offsets. We grew up in this in the prairies in Canada, resource economy. And there was a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety around this future that was sort of unknown at the time around what carbon offsetting would look like. Is it going to be cap and trade? What's that going to be? And so as a result, you were seeing a lot of organizations that were concerned about, the future price and what that would do to impact their business. And so my brother and I, not fully really knowing much about that, being 15, 16 years old, whatever we were, thought, maybe there's a solution here, a business opportunity to support some of these companies that are not going to be able to meet their commitments or, need a sustainable supply of offsets. And again, not really knowing much about it, we thought, well, trees seem like a good idea because, trees take CO2 out of the air.
And what year was this?
This would have been probably 2007.
Okay.
2006, 2007, something like that. And so we came up with this idea of take some farmlands that you can't really grow a whole heck of a lot and plant a tree farm on it. And those trees will create a long-term supply of offsets that will be significantly less expensive than, alternative supplies of offsets. And so we were fortunate. We had a number of businesses that chose to take a chance on us. And we bought 640 acres of land. We planted 150,000 trees, and it sort of served as like our, call it summer, but also through the year job for the next 4 or 5 years of our lives. It was this really incredible experience. Ultimately, the business model wasn't viable because it was premature for sort of where the carbon markets were going, but it opened our eyes to the impact that tree planting could have, both on the environment, particularly in this small little 640 acre plot, but also globally. We got connected with this network of organizations that were using tree planting to provide jobs and food security and poverty alleviation, and really incredible stuff. And so we kind of left that experience, that call it sort of high school business, and knew we wanted to create something that allowed us to plant trees. And so it was my brother and our other partner, Dave, who kind of came up with this idea of saying, well, what if we created a brand and a product around that brand that allowed us to plant trees? And at the end of the day, we were really agnostic as to what that product was, but the idea was pretty simple: is that the profit from that product would allow us to plant as many trees as we possibly could. And, it turned out that, we came up with this idea of creating a t-shirt. So we bought some American Apparel t-shirts, we put a logo on it. We figured out that we could, support the funding of 10 trees through that planting or through the sale of that t-shirt. And we started selling them. And we were really fortunate that, that idea and that model and the tangibility of selling a product and planting trees really took off. And, for us, it's been a wild journey over the last decade here of just seeing that grow, seeing people, connected to the product and the impact that product represents. Like you mentioned at the beginning, this year, our 10th year in business, we'll plant our 100 millionth tree, which is a pretty cool milestone for us.
Amazing. I want to also paint the picture of most of this early on. I think you said up till the 7th year mark that you had bootstrapped the entire thing, right? And you had built, whether it's the e-commerce store, the supply chain, right? All these all these attributes that go into to building a multi-million revenue sort of e-commerce store. I guess talk about the early stages of the first 7 years, right? And doing it, not obviously all on your own, because now you have employees and things like that as you went along the way. But in those first 3 years, what was it like just building out the infrastructure of, because I want people to understand that they can also do this, right? You don't need, $1 million, $10 million in venture capital early on to build out something incredible and profitable and impactful at the same time. So maybe walk us through like just the journey of building out maybe the first 3 years from maybe a tech stack point of view, and maybe the hurdles of getting the store at scale a little bit.
For sure. I mean, you mentioned and you said it right. Like it wasn't all to do with me. It's largely probably in spite of me most of the time. As far as you said it right. Like we've been fortunate to build this business largely profitably since the get-go. And I think it came from a place of, we didn't realize until we were sort of 5, 6, 7 years into the business that was more the exception than the rule.
Right.
Nobody told us when we started tentree that you're just supposed to lose a bunch of money the whole time and raise a ton of capital. And, I think particularly now with the changing sort of, market dynamics where investors are also running away from growth in pursuit of cash flow and things like that. I think you're seeing a lot of this sort of artificial market that we've created because of effectively free capital is falling apart. And you're seeing a lot of the businesses in our space, whether that be sort of the sustainability minded businesses, or it be the sort of consumer facing brands, particularly the D2C that you talked about, are no longer able to go back to the well. This idea of I'm going to raise $10 million just to put it into Facebook is kind of falling apart with the changes to iOS and the changes to all these different things out there. So, I mean, for us, our approach as a business has always been to operate profitably. And really, when we did explore bringing in a little bit of outside capital, it was for specific things. It was not to, support the operations of the business so much as it was to invest in the fundamental things that we just hadn't necessarily done. Better ERP system, better auditing, better tech stack, better website and rebranding, and then also the investment in what's since been spun out as a separate business, which is veritree. I think your question was like, what did we do differently? I wouldn't say it really comes down to us doing anything that dramatically different. I think what it comes down to is being disciplined as a founder around what it actually takes to build a truly sustainable business. And I don't just mean sustainable from the standpoint of like ESG. I mean sustainable from the standpoint of revenue, profit, cash flow positive. Because with this sort of artificial environment that's been created because of like low cost capital, it's actually led to this self-fulfilling, call it cycle, where venture capital raises a bunch of money. Venture capital needs to deploy it. They deploy it. They make big splashy PR announcements around how this company or that company raised all this money. And then that company then needs to deploy it in the next 18 to 24 months so that they can justify their next raise at a higher valuation. And at the end of the day, that is just fundamentally a bit of a disjointed way to build most businesses. If some businesses, absolutely. Like if you're in a giant land grab scenario, you're a Facebook, you're,
Airbnb,
Netflix,
Uber.
Airbnb. It's a different approach. But when you're talking about consumer brands, when you're talking about, frankly, the vast majority of companies, they do not need to get on that sort of merry-go-round. And so I think for us, it really just came back to, we focused on fundamentals. We focused on what do we need to have as a bottom line to reinvest in the business in order to support next year's growth. And we worked our impact, the tree planting, everything like that into the cost of the product. For us, it is the same as the organic cotton threads to us, was the planting of the trees. And so really for us, we also got very diligent about what it would take to acquire customers. And we weren't sort of looking to other businesses and their splashy press releases and getting anxiety about why aren't we growing fast enough? Because I think, it's one thing to go fast. It's another thing to go far. And we're fortunate that I think we've not only been able to go pretty darn fast, I'd say, but we've actually been able to maintain it and continue that growth and that momentum, which you're seeing a lot of people not be able to do in the last couple of years.
I want to talk a little bit about the apparel industry in general, right? And we could say fashion, apparel, whatever we want to call it, right? It's a massive global business that has historically been, not so friendly to the earth, right? And has really been an extractive industry. And I love seeing brands really take an effort to be like, okay, how can we actually improve these dynamics in this massive industry? Talk a little bit about the effort that goes into just like looking at apparel and trade. How can we truly be sustainable, ethical from the materials, from the supply chain as you scale, right? Do those problems become harder? Become easier? Like just talk about the industry itself and how to make it, truly sustainable and ethical.
For sure. It's hard. I mean, you asked, does it get easier or harder the bigger you get? I would say some problems get easier, some problems get harder. But at the end of the day, it's still just a very challenging thing to do to really push a industry towards change, which a lot of it's already happening. But it goes back to when we started Tentree, which again, we were agnostic as to the product. It didn't have to be apparel. It could have been anything. The idea was that we create a product and a brand around that allows us to plant trees. What I believe we recognized was that us attaching ourselves to apparel was frankly a fundamental part of our trajectory, because apparel truly is this business, this product, whether it's fashion, apparel, you talked about, that has cultural resonance. And you've seen it a lot in the last decade where the consumers transition from this idea of, frankly, just buying product to actually supporting the product that fits their values. And apparel, like something you wear on your body, is one of the purest representations of that from my perspective. For us, it has been a journey. And I think the way we look at it is that first we sort of embrace this fallibility that people have challenged us on before, and also rightfully so, that you say you're doing all this good by planting trees, but what if the vehicle to get those trees in the ground, which our vehicle is apparel, is actually creating a negative impact? And the reality is that no matter how sustainable, I'm doing sort of air quotes around that, right. we get, we're still having some negative impact.
Sure.
There's still fibers, there's still, manufacturing, all these sorts of things. So there's still some sort of negative impact on the planet that's being created. So our approach has been to say, we exist to plant trees, and we connect the consumer at the start of that journey with the trees at the end of that journey. And if that vehicle right now is apparel, we want to make sure that apparel doesn't just have less negative impact, it has no negative impact. So that's sort of the challenge we put to our team. And we said, okay, what would that take? So for us, it really came down to first understanding the footprint of that product, and then reducing the footprint of that product through, within the supply chain. So that means things like, better materials, organic cotton or recycled cotton, fair trade, all these sorts of things versus conventional. And in addition, we've done a ton of work around things like insetting, which is, planting trees in the cotton fields that we're working with, or, bringing our factories to closer proximity to one another, so there's less movement of materials. So it's really about, understanding the footprint of your product and reducing it. And then no matter what, you still end up with some negative. There's still something that's left over. And so for us, what we do, and it's not perfect by any stretch, but it's a step, I believe, in the right direction, is that we measure our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for that product. So effectively, all the carbon footprint of that product, from the seed to the consumer to whatever the end of life is of that, and we offset it every single year. And then finally, it kind of comes down to that last point, which is that end of life of the product. And we're trying to create as many vehicles as we can for that. So we're creating take back programs, resale programs, and we've also mandated for our product team that within the next 5 years, every one of our products should either be fully compostable or fully recyclable.
There's so many difficulties there. I think that, obviously just the ability to even measure, your carbon emissions as a company, I don't know if it's fairly new, but it seems like the technology has, maybe the last 5 years or so really enabled that, where every business can sort of assess their supply chain their manufacturing, their production, whatever it may be, and really get just, a dashboard view of, of their impact, whether positive, negative, whatever it may be. But at least it allows for brands to then make an educated decision on how to become, a better company, a better brand, just from having like better tools, right? Better technology. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I'm of two minds on it. I think you made the right point at the end there, which is that it allows you to make educated decisions. At the end of the day, and not a lot of people don't really talk about this, but a lot of this like footprinting analysis, a lot of the work that's being done in sort of like technology to determine the carbon footprint of X or Y is all bullshit. Especially when you get into scope 3 emissions, like it's all the law of averages, and it's averages on top of averages on top of averages. And so the reality is, and again, nobody really talks about this, is that number that you end up making your decisions off of is there's a high probability that number is very off. Now, the hope is that when you do that 1,000 times, some might be high, some might be low, but at the end of the day, it gives you, to your point, this ability to make educated decisions, and it's directional. And then if you start with some form of measurement and you hope that measurement continues to improve year after year, but it also is based off sort of similar principles each year, and you continue to make better decisions, then you should see that measurement continue to go in a way that at the very least you can make better decisions off of. But, I think this is one of the problems that's facing a lot of the sort of ESG and sustainability narrative, is that a lot of it is lacking a level of transparency and verification, and frankly, just like good data. There's a lot of people that are talking about AI. There's a lot of people, and just the reality with a lot of this stuff is like, we don't necessarily have the data models or the data sets yet to really do the kind of things that we are selling the future, and I get that, especially in the startup space. And I mean, I've done it before too, but I think there's definitely in all this stuff a need for recognition that like we're not where we want to be, but the investment today needs to be made in order to get there.
I think it's a decent segue opportunity for veritree. Speaking of technology and just, the idea of being transparent, being verifiable, whether it's the carbon markets with offsets, whether it's just planting trees at a fundamental level and say, hey, this has been planted, here it is, here's sort of the benefits of it being here, what kind of tree is it, whatever it may be, right? Talk us just through the advent of veritree and what it was intended to do first, and maybe what it's moving into now.
So we started the build of veritree about 3 years ago, and it was frankly a recognition internally that we were spending millions of dollars every year on the planting of trees. And we didn't necessarily feel like we were getting the level of real-time data verification, auditing, and kind of manageability. I don't know if that's a word that we felt like we needed. And so we were approaching this from the standpoint of, okay, tentree is growing. Tentree's investments in restoration are growing. And we also found that we were starting to see more and more people step into this space of buy X, plant Y. And we had a number of our partners approach us and say, we have 1,000 business partners, and 600 or 700 of them came to us from tentree. And because we were supporting, if people reached out to us, we would pass them along to some people that we felt were really doing great work. And I think our realization was that if we weren't feeling like we were getting the level of transparency we needed, and we were also creating a bigger industry just through the communications and the success of our business, we really needed to have a more solid footing. And so it was about 3 years ago, we started investing in the building of a technology that would allow us to collect data directly from the ground, manage that data, put it through different verification workflows, and then also allow us to continue to monitor that inflow and attach it directly to the projects we were supporting, and then effectively turn each tree into an inventory item. So we through the collection of the data from the ground and the verification workflows, we were able to basically turn each tree into kind of what we called an inventory item or a tree token. And this system effectively became a tree RP. So it allowed us to treat each tree like an inventory item, make sure that it wasn't double counted, make sure that it wasn't allocated to multiple partners, that, because there's this running joke in tree planting that one tree gets sold, a million times.
And, right.
And then in addition to that, once those trees are kind of run through this workflow, we were then able to continue to monitor them in an ongoing basis. And so we built this for ourselves over the last kind of 2 years, and it really wasn't in the plan to roll this out into a separate business. But it was about 7 or 8 months ago where we started having a number of organizations sort of banging on our door to say, we want to plant trees with you, and we want to leverage the technology that you've built. And so it was one of the first partners was Samsung. And from there, it's kind of been a bit of just a snowball of other businesses that have approached us and said, we really want to invest in restoration. We want to invest in verifiable, auditable restoration, and we want to be a part of what you're building. And so it's been really humbling, and we've been really fortunate. But at the end of the day, at its core, veritree was built to bring more verification, more transparency, and auditability to the global reforestation space.
And so it started as an in-house product, essentially, right? And then from then it just became, it took a little bit of life of its own after it sort of working, and you already had these embedded customers, right? You kind of already had them, and sort of just, I said, okay, let's productize it rather than being an internal tool. We can extend it to other brands that want to do this, and then scale up the idea of planting trees. Going back to the verification of it, I know it's difficult. I've been talking to a lot of people in this space, and just as it's really difficult to measure these carbon emissions and all these other stuff where we're talking about transparency and measuring things, how do you actually measure the planting of the tree and verify it, right? I know it's done on blockchain, but there's still some steps that are done to even put it on chain. I know it's probably a boring topic to talk about, but how does it, what's the life cycle of getting verified and then giving it on chain?
Yeah, it's definitely pretty involved, but and I think I would just caveat all this with saying it's still just like we talked about with other technologies, we're still improving and evolving, and it's not necessarily where we want it to be yet. But at its core, what we've tried to solve for with veritree is ground truth, because to us, there's really two elements of it, what we kind of consider 360-degree monitoring for reforestation projects. And to us, the first 5 years are largely ground truth, because satellite imagery, geospatial, things like that, really aren't equipped to kind of monitor and verify when the planting is in its infancy like that. So really from years 5 to 10, it becomes sort of a split of geospatial and ground truth. And then onwards, it's largely geospatial. You can use, LiDAR, satellite imagery, things like that to continue to monitor these projects. And the interesting thing is if you take this, call it 25-year lifespan of a restoration project, just to kind of keep it at least somewhat sort of bookended, you kind of take this carbon sequestration curve, and you say, okay, it's relatively low for the first 5 to 7 years, and then it really ramps up thereafter. And then it likely, depending on the type of tree planting too, this is more, call it like mangroves than say drywood or hardwood, or, call it like spruce tree planting. And then, call it by year 20, it really sort of tops out, and then it kind of flatlines. And so naturally, the area that we've invested a lot of our technology is in this geospatial space, which is really largely focused on when that carbon is actually being sucked out of the air. But if you, again, overlay that chart with this idea of, okay, what is the effort that is being put into these projects, and not just the effort, but the impact that effort will have on the future carbon sequestration. It's the inverse. It's the flip of that. It's very high in the first 5 years, and then it starts to fall down throughout. And then largely once you get to years 10 onwards, it's largely monitoring that can be done via remote sensing technology. And so our approach has always been, because frankly, over these last decade, we've worked with so many amazing partners and we've been on the ground and we've really been in the mud with them, is to solve for the ground truth component, because that was the area that was receiving, frankly, a lack of investment. And it's also trying to solve a lot of the hard problems that you need different technology, like getting out in the field, gathering data. And
right. There's still a huge human component to it. All this technology still needs a human component.
It's exactly it. And so for us, it's been about creating what we sort of consider the operating system for that. So we created a full collection of a toolkit of products that are used to collect data directly from the field. And then we built in API integrations into a ton of other sort of inputs, whether it be different sort of underwater monitoring for some of our kelp planting projects, or it be, other data collection devices. And we collect all that data and it sort of comes in through this funnel of all these different inputs. And then really it's about putting it through what we kind of consider this veritree operating system, which is able to attach those pieces of evidence to the planting project. So, a KML file that gets uploaded around the planting project, and then any evidence, whether it be survivability, planting report, photo evidence, socioeconomic forms, different acoustic sensors and monitoring and things like that, and attaching it to the sort of the planting report to say, here's how many trees were planted. Is this deemed to be a level of verifiability that we believe? And let's say it's, we got a planting report that said 20,000 trees were planted this day. The idea would be that collectively with the packaged up with the evidence of photos and other monitoring APIs that we've built, that we would then be able to put it through the verification workflow to say it's been signed off on by multiple parties, both on the ground at the, call it, head office level, and then at the veritree level. So it basically runs through this process of packaging up evidence, attaching that evidence to as close to real-time planting updates as we can get, making sure that runs through sort of our programmatic algorithms to make sure that there's no big red flags. It's a polygon that should hold 1 million trees and somebody did fat fingers and inputted, too many, and being able to identify inconsistencies. And then it goes through the necessary verification steps before those trees get, ultimately approved. And to your point, are then at the point where they could be submitted to chain.
It's almost this digital supply chain, just like tentree has sort of this physical supply chain. It sort of goes through the same, you have to get the materials, you have to make the clothing, you have to ship the clothing, you have to, there's these processes in a supply chain for the apparel. And now there's also this process in this sort of digital, verification of trees goes through this similar process of being a supply chain of processes that happen before it's, verified, or for tentree before it lands at a person's house, for them to wear.
That's it. I mean, it's all about workflows, right?
Yeah.
And I think the reality is that there's a lot of people that are trying to create very prescriptive approaches to this too. That hasn't really been our approach. We've created, again, our own collection toolkits, our own monitoring sort of form submission software that, can be submit forms directly into our system. And we've deployed hundreds of devices into the field to collect this data. But at the same time, we recognize that some planting organizations have their own devices already up and running. They have their own ways of collecting data. So really for us, it's also been about creating the core endpoints where we can collect that data, other groups can submit it, and we can also run it through this workflow to make sure, okay, it maybe wasn't submitted through the veritree collection device, but it was submitted through a device that we have confidence in, and it meets certain criteria, and we're able to sort of agree that this is verifiable in some way. And so we also, our head of sustainability, she actually came to us from the World Resource Institute, and she was one of the lead authors of the Road to Restoration, which was really a massive document around how do you actually measure the impact of reforestation. And so for us, it's about taking this, this giant thousands and thousands of potential inputs and really pulling it down into the core tenets of what make a sustainable restoration project, making sure that we understand, okay, if there's 10 of those core tenets, are we comfortable with a project? Because a project won't meet all of them, but what are the 3 or 4 that they are submitting reports against? What are the key identifiers and things that are being reported on to support those core tenets? And what is the sort of way that data is being submitted, whether it's satellite imagery, whether it's our own collection devices, whether it's others, that sort of thing. So it's really about creating an operating system today as well. And this kind of is what I believe is so important is 5 years from now, we're going to have invested hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, probably billions of dollars into reforestation. It's going to be huge.
Yep.
And if we wait till 5, 6, 7 years from now, and we look back at all the satellite imagery and we say, looks like very little of the intended impact actually happened, that's going to be a problem. And is actually a very real possibility if we don't do the right things now at the ground level. And then as well, also be able to make better decisions faster because we have a data-driven approach from the ground to what makes a good restoration project.
There's so many follow-ups I'd like to come on this with, but I want to be sensitive of your time, and I want to maybe we can have another episode dedicated to reforestation and technology and carbon markets and this new sort of financial market that is essentially brewing under our feet right now, which can be immensely powerful to the planet in a positive way, but could also, like you said, go down a path that some of us don't want to go down because that's what happens when money gets involved with things, right? When there's sort of markets involved, there's volatility and there's players on both sides, some good and some bad, right? So maybe we'll set another time for a whole conversation around that.
We should just be clear too. We know that our need for verifiable offsetting is going to be enormous, and we also know that nature-based solutions must be anywhere from a quarter to a third of our global offsetting needs. And in addition to that, there's also the UN has released reports that say we need financing for conservation and restoration to exceed $500 billion a year by 2050. And so we know the money is coming. We know we need the systems today to get there. And there are incredible groups doing amazing work out there. I think the challenge that we see right now, though, is that there's very little consistency in how we collect that data today. And so that 5 years from now, when we try to look back at the work we've done and what was the impact, it could be that we look back and say this impact is fantastic, but you're still going to end up with all these disparate ways of measuring and monitoring and frankly, very little ability to say, okay, we've got the secret sauce. We now know how, and it's an oversimplification because there's different projects, different regions, there is no secret sauce, but we need to be able to understand what are the core drivers of sustainable, long-term, effective restoration projects. And so to us, it really comes down to today approaching these projects with a data-driven approach.
I want to end on 2 questions here. First would be around what are the goals for tentree, right? Is it 1 billion trees, right? When you look at, whether it's your annual meeting, monthly, quarterly, however, when you'll sit down and kind of talk about whether it's goals, metrics, do you look at how many trees we planted this quarter as the barometer of growth, or is it like a traditional business, right? Where you look at, sales, and then obviously that equals trees planted, but then you can also look at trees planted and that equals X amount of sales or revenue, right? How do you look at goals for tentree as far as it's impacted, because it's so related to sales and revenue? Is the goal like 1 billion, right? 1 billion trees. It doesn't seem insurmountable at this point, at 100 million. I guess, what are the goals for tentree when we look at maybe the next 10 years? Let's keep it all 10 related right now.
Yeah, it has been And it, ultimately continues to be to plant a billion trees. You hit the nail on the head. And when we talk about sales targets internally, even when we give our sales reps sales targets, we give them planting targets. And, obviously to your point, you can say, okay, based on an average unit retail, that's X amount of revenue and all that sort of thing. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we still do need to run it like a business. We need revenue targets, we need profitability and margin targets, all that sort of stuff. But what we talk about internally is planting. And what I would say is sometimes we regret this oversimplification that we've created of just a tree or 10 trees, because truly at the end of this year, we're going to do a big look back of like all that we've learned through 100 million trees being planted. And I think if there is one thing we've learned, it's that this idea of equating a single tree to something, it's incredibly powerful because of its symbolism and the emotional connection it can create. But it also is an oversimplification of all the impact, all the effort, everything that needs to go into it. So I think when we look at the next 10 years, it's not just about getting a billion sticks in the ground. It's about making sure that we have that impact through verifiable, auditable, transparent restoration that is actually going to have the intended long-term impact, not just the marketing story.
Right. The last question I'll end on here is, you've kind of built a lot of really impactful things. You took the road of kind of, bootstrapping in a way and kind of building it with you and your team, and then, realized another, pain point within your own business and created another business off of that. What are just some advice that you would give maybe current entrepreneurs now or aspiring ones coming into their entrepreneurial journey of how to start to build something, right? And don't maybe overthink it, just kind of do it, move fast and break things, or, really sit down and think about, what do you want to build for a decade? That's how I was trying to look at things. And do you want to build something to get acquired in 3 years, or do you want to build something that is, you're going to spend a decade in your life on, 15 years, 20 years of your life? Those are two very different, mindsets and companies you'll probably build if you look at it from those two different dynamics. But what some of advice would you give to those two sets?
I mean, I can't speak to the model of, build it to sell it sort of thing. Sometimes, it would have been a lot easier journey if that was maybe the approach. But there's no negative reflection of that. I mean, it's just not what we've approached. I think we've approached tentree, and as a result, veritree, and likely whatever we do in the future is in addition to that, from the standpoint of really what do we want to build and what impact do we want that to have on the planet. And then really for us, it's been about putting our heads down, having conviction about that future, and working to solve problems that are going to get in the way of us getting there. I think when you look at tentree, to us, tentree is as much an amazing business as it is a reflection of what we believe the future of business will be, which to us is, this idea of a restorative business model, a sustainable business model, both from a profitability standpoint and a business model standpoint, but not just in the sense of doing less bad, which I think the vast majority of sustainability is, but actually using business as a vehicle for good. And when we look at veritree, we recognize that the future of reforestation needs to be data-driven, and we recognize that business has to play a huge role in our transition from a climate standpoint. And so for us, veritree is about, also taking everything we've learned at tentree, packaging it up, and creating thousands and thousands of tentrees and supporting other businesses and doing things similar to what we've done over the last decade. So I think it's a long-winded answer, but my belief is we're also in a unique moment in time where I think founders have an opportunity to put their heads down and build for the next 18 months, because the world is going to be very rocky. And coming out of that, I think there's going to be a huge opportunity for people that took this moment to really reflect, build businesses and business models that truly solve a problem that they believe is with conviction needs to be solved in order to get to where we need to be in 30 years. Coming out of this next period of whether it's recession or whatever you want to call it, we will have huge opportunity for acceleration of these new business models. And I just think there's such an incredible opportunity for new founders. So to me, it's put your head down, build. Don't look at all the fancy, exciting press releases that are happening, because 90% of them are bullshit.
Yep.
And are self-serving. And actually, the people that are doing those press releases are putting them out oftentimes because they're not doing anything else actually interesting. And frankly, I sometimes look at our own press releases and think that too. Put your head down, build, and have conviction about what you think the problems we need to solve are to get to where we need to be in the next 20 or 30 years.
Amazing. I'm trying to make this the new press release. Trying to get all people to ban press releases and have the press release medium.
I joke because press releases are obviously an important component of getting media and news out there. But I've always had a bit of a sore spot for them. I've especially just in the D2C space, there's been so many venture-backed groups that announce these huge fundraisers only to, kind of basically say, thanks for the 20 million. We just sold a quarter of our company and now we're going to give it to Facebook. Yep. And I just think that some of those models are evolving and they need to, but it's a function of a lot of other things.
Well, thank you so much, my man. I really appreciate you taking the time. I've definitely admired you and what the team has been building from afar for a while. So glad we could finally sit down and do this in sort of a proper way. But obviously, really would love to have you on again to kind of talk about a lot of other things going on in the global reforestation space and nature markets, which soon to be there's so many different cool things going on that have a potential to really kind of make this, business as a force, to do good rather than do less bad. I do think we're at this point where it's possible. And if we get the right people building in it, I think it does have the potential to really kind of, solve a lot of these issues, that we sort of face right now. So, a little bit optimistic, but we'd love to have you back on one day, man. Keep up the great work and best of luck for the next 10 years.
Appreciate that, Grant. Thanks for having me.